Welcome to the Economic Rockstar Podcast with your host, Frank Conway, connecting brilliant minds in economics and finance.
In this week's episode of the Economic Rockstar Podcast, I speak with Professor Steve Horwitz, Professor of Economics at St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York. We talk about Austrian economics, the Microfoundations of Macroeconomics, what caused the Great Recession, the role of government, the three economic myths as found by Professor Horwitz, including the gender inequality gap and the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, about Karl Menger, the link between Adam Smith and Hayek, and how the private sector responded better than government to the devastation caused by Hurricane Katrina, and whether this is a case for free market economics. Professor Horwitz also shares with us some of his recommended books, his pedagogical approach to teaching economics, and who he'd like to meet if he was able to time travel. You can check out all the links, resources and books mentioned in this episode at economicrockstar.com/Steve Horwitz. Never miss an episode of the Economic Rockstar podcast. Visit economicrockstar.com, submit your name and email, and you will get each episode straight to your inbox.
If you really are driven to understand how the world works, you'll find, you might want to be a psychologist or a sociologist or a natural scientist. But if you latch on to economics, suddenly you've got this kind of key that opens this door to understanding the social world in all these powerful ways. Rush's lyricist, Neil Peart, in the 70s, when they were young and starting out, read a lot of Rand. It was very influenced by Rand. The other guys were, but to a lesser extent. And so he incorporated in his lyrics a lot of themes from Rand and from libertarianism in general. You can find Hayekian themes, lots of individualist themes in their music, particularly in their earlier music. But what Hayek does is to say, what spontaneous orders are really about is, to use the title of this famous paper, the use of knowledge in society, right? How we generate order out of self-interest is by having this price system and other institutions that enable us to make use of other people's knowledge.
Hi, Frank Conway here, and you're listening to the Economic Rockstar Podcast. I am so honoured to have Professor Steve Horwitz join me today. Hi, Steve. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Frank. I'm very happy to be here.
Steve Horwitz is a Charles A. Dana Professor of Economics at St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York, and is currently visiting scholar at Ball State University, Indiana. Professor Horwitz is also an affiliated senior scholar at the Mercatus Center, Virginia, a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute in Canada, and a distinguished fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education. Steve is the author of 3 books: Monetary Evolution, Free Banking and Economic Order, Microfoundations and Macroeconomics, an Austrian Perspective, and Hayek's Modern Family, Classical Liberalism and the Evolution of Social Institutions. He has written extensively on Austrian economics, Hayekian political economy, monetary theory and history, and American economic history. Steve has a series of popular YouTube videos for the Learn Liberty series from the Institute for Humane Studies and blogs at Bleeding Heart Libertarians, and writes regularly for FEE.org. A member of the Mont Pelerin Society, he has a PhD in economics from George Mason University and an AB in economics and philosophy from the University of Michigan. Steve, I'm taking a breather there for a moment.
That's a lot of stuff.
It's a lot of stuff, and I hope, I was hoping you'd probably be thinking, oh, just move on, please. Just but just for the listeners to get if they could catch up with my speaking faster, obviously these are going to be on the show notes, the introduction and that. But, from that introduction, I just wanted to give people an overview and an idea of where you're coming from in terms of your own economic perspective on things. Yep. And it lies really in the heart of Austrian economic theory. But one thing I'll talk a little bit about that. Where did you get that, or how did you evolve into an Austrian economist? Was this something that you were taught at undergrad level, or something you found meaningful when you discovered it?
More of the latter, more finding it meaningful when I discovered it. The short version of the story is I became a libertarian at age 16 or so, when I was still a high school student. So when I went off to college at the University of Michigan, I was already a libertarian, though I wasn't especially interested in economics. I went to college in 1981 thinking I would maybe do computer science or something. But I had my freshman year, my first year, I had one course sort of empty, right? Where I could take a fifth course. I needed to take a fifth course. And I thought to myself, if I'm going to be serious about this libertarian stuff, I probably should know some economics. That might be helpful. So I took a Principles of Economics course in my freshman year. And I think I had the experience that a lot of other economists have people who are now economists have when they took intro, which was you think, oh my God, right? The world. Yeah, right. This is right. This is how I've always sort of seen the world. And now I have this way of doing it systematically and rigorously. And it just made complete sense to me. And it was certainly helpful in thinking about the politics that I already had. So, I sort of quickly changed my, I hadn't declared a major yet, but it was clear I was going to be an economics major. I had the interest in philosophy also for reasons related to the libertarianism. And around that same time, of course, since I was reading libertarian authors like Rothbard and a little bit of Mises, I started reading more economics and started reading the Austrian school folks because they were the names I was knowing from having read some libertarianism. And really, I'd say by the middle of my time at the University of Michigan, I was already an Austrian, at least in my head. And I also knew I wanted to go get a PhD, and I knew about the George Mason program. And I tell people by the time I was maybe in my third year of college, I pretty much hoped I would be doing, more or less what I'm doing right now, which is, having a teaching position, being able to write books and articles and do econ rockstar interviews, right? So all these sort of things were, in some vague sense were what I imagined and what I wanted to do. And all that has more or less happened. So I was a libertarian first and then an Austrian next, but all that happened, while I either in high school or as an undergraduate.
And that's such a young age to actually find your calling as such, if you want to say that, in terms of economics, at 16 years of age and discovering this. And it might have been a lucky coincidence that you had to find out one module or subject that you had to fulfill. But to be able to grasp that type of meaning and that interpretation of the economy, it takes a lot of dedication and understanding and questioning of things. And to do that, you obviously had a mature brain to try and capture that and cope with that.
Well, yeah, thank you. I think there's two other things at work here. My father is an academic. He's in finance, and accounting, so not quite the same as economics. He's more of a business school person. So, that in that sense, I understood what it meant to have the life of a professor and sort of envision that. Though what I do in that way is very different from what my dad does. But I also think, from a young age, I wanted to understand how the world worked. Right. And I think if you really are driven to understand how the world works, you'll find, you might want to be a psychologist or a sociologist or a natural scientist. But if you, latch on to economics, suddenly you've got this kind of key that opens this door to understanding the social world in all these powerful ways. And I would say too that I think at that age, I had a very vague might be not strong enough. I had a limited understanding of what Austrian economics was really about. And I think by the time I got to graduate school at George Mason and had that experience, then, you sort of realize, okay, this is even more complicated and sophisticated and nuanced than I thought it was. And even today, I'm still learning things as I read more and as I interact with people and so on. So I think part of all of this is a desire to be, as we like to say at St. Lawrence, to be a lifelong learner, right? To always want to improve your understanding of the world.
Let's go back to what you were saying there. What is Austrian economics? I know I've addressed something like this already in previous podcasts, but your own interpretation of economics and of Austrian economics. Yeah,
well, let's kind of maybe tackle them both at once, right? I think that what economics helps us do is to understand the world in terms of the plans that people have, their attempts to execute those plans, and the systematic unintended consequences that those plans produce when people's plans interact with each other. So, and many of the plans that people have are attempts to, attempts to improve themselves, usually through exchange. And so one of the things that we study most fundamentally in economics is how people engage in exchange and other forms of action to improve their well-being. In Mises' terms, to remove their felt uneasiness. And that leads us to study how people organize their own sort of resources and sort of engage in economic calculation and sort of figure out what actions they wish to take and in what order and how and sort of what their preferences are and what their constraints are. But it also forces us to think about the institutional context in which those take place. Are we exchanging under, in a market? Are we exchanging under the rules of politics? Are we exchanging sort of with intimate friends and relatives? The rules of the game, as we like to say, matter a lot for whether the unintended consequences of that self-interested action, of that exchanges will be beneficial or harmful. So certainly one of the most important things that economics studies is not just how self-interest leads to benefits or harms for others, but how the rules of the game, how institutions, how the beliefs that people have affect that process. And some rules, some institutions work better than others that in leading self-interest to benefit other people. And so economics is the study of all those things in a whole variety of different contexts. And I think that is also, a pretty good understanding of Austrian economics. And from the Austrian perspective, we just focus on the subjectivity of choice and action, that what matters is how people perceive the world, that affects how the choices they make and the actions they take. And if we want to understand the social world, we have to start with people's perceptions. But again, those perceptions and those actions get played out under systems of rules, and that produces, what our analysis is figuring out the consequences that those produce. And I think for Austrians, that means we do a lot of things in natural language. We use the, logical analysis. We use historical evidence. We are more skeptical of mathematical models and somewhat more skeptical of statistical testing as ways to understand the social world, because we think human beings are not the same as molecules, right? And human beings choose. And because we are also human beings, we can understand their choices and their outcomes in ways that are more rich and different than, say, studying the physical world.
Can I ask you, Steve, what is it with George Mason University? And I don't know whether it's some degree of coincidence that there seems to be almost like 1 or 2 degrees separation with my guests now on this podcast. They've either attended George Mason or they've been featured guests on the podcast. And I start realizing this only lately because recently I've spoken to Russ Roberts.
Yep.
I've had Peter Bedke.
Yep. Chris Coyne was on too, I think.
Chris Coyne, Peter Leeson. A lot of people.
Yeah. Well, and I think, the history is probably important here because Pete Bedke and I were contemporaries in grad school. He's a very good friend of mine. And I think when we got there in 1984, 1985, two things had happened. There was already a kind of group of a couple people who were sympathetic to Austrian and public choice economics there. And the most important person of all those was Karen Vaughan, who was the department chair at the time. Karen's a longtime Austrian economist. And there was also some other people too who were interested in Austrian economics. But what Karen did in 1983 or 82 or 83 was to persuade Jim Buchanan, who eventually won a Nobel Prize in 86, to move the Public Choice Center from where it was at Virginia Tech University to George Mason University. And that was an incredible feat of entrepreneurship on Karen's part and a risk on Jim Buchanan's part to go to a sort of relatively no-name school, a third-rate school. But they created an econ PhD program in the early 80s. Pete and I were among, not the very first, but sort of the first big group of folks who came in there, and they hired Don Lavoie, may he rest in peace, Jack Hyde, Don Boudreau was first there at the time, George Selgin was there, Tom DiLorenzo was there at the time. Lots of really good people got hired in that era, and that created a kind of reputation for the place. And later on, Vernon Smith and the experimentalists moved, and Vernon has since moved on. But there was a period where you had Buchanan and Tulloch and Vernon Smith, and the Austrians there. And so a lot was going on. And of course, Don Lavoie passed on in 2001. But before he died, they were able to hire Pete there. And Pete's, sort of presence, and then Don Boudreau was department chair for a while. Of course, Walter Williams was there, but Pete has certainly now built that into an Austrian sort of Virginia political economy powerhouse, just cranking out PhD students. Pete Leeson and Chris Coyne were students of Pete Bedke's, and now they're there doing the same thing. And you got people like Brian Kaplan and again, we could go on. But what's happened is you kind of Tyler Cowen, you sort of met the critical threshold there, right? Where it's now a community and they agree on what they want to see in terms of economics. And so that has made them able to hire the people they want to do the kind of things they want. It's a tremendous place to study economics.
Yeah. And Steve, I think I heard piano keys in the background there.
I have a new computer. I haven't figured out how to turn off all the sounds yet. So that's
all right. That leads perfectly on to my next question. I've read recently that you like a bit of classic rock or soft rock, and you've done an article. You wrote an article called "Rand, Rush, and Detotalizing the Utopianism of Progressive Rock."
Yes,
and I'd love to know, what has rock and the band Rush have to do with Rand and their approach to music and libertarianism?
Oh, well, we could do a whole show on this, but I'll keep it short. So Rush's lyricist, Neil Peart, in the 70s when they were young and starting out, read a lot of Rand. It was very influenced by Rand. The other guys were, but to a lesser extent. And so he incorporated in his lyrics a lot of themes from Rand and from libertarianism in general. You can find Hayekian themes, lots of individualist themes in their music, particularly in their earlier music. As he kind of matured and grew older, the music was less explicitly political or philosophical, but still the themes of individualism are there. And so I think it's an interesting sort of cultural thing to look at, to see how they have made use of those ideas in their music. I think for me, it's an interesting place. And there's a lot of people who, I discovered Rush and Ayn Rand and libertarianism sort of all around the same time in my late years in high school. So for me, they're really very much bound up, right, in each other. So again, there's a lot of interesting stuff I think there to look at. I also think, by the way, that as a band, how they've kind of conducted themselves with sort of playing the kind of music they've wanted to play and navigating their careers with a great deal of integrity. And as they once said, being not in the mainstream, but sort of walking along the bank of the mainstream, really is an interesting metaphor for Austrian economists to think about, right? How we sort of touch the mainstream of economics, but we're not in it. Right. And that has enabled them to kind of be able to do the things they've wanted to do musically. And for me, that's been a kind of model for me to think about my own career, that I want to be able to write about and do the things I want to do without having to worry whether it meets some sort of mainstream test or not. If I think it's good economics or good social theory, I'm going to do it.
I recall, just when you're saying that, you're talking about Rush, I recall at the age of maybe 8 or 9 with my pocket money going down into the town with my brother and actually buying one of Rush's singles. All I can remember is the cover. I think it was kind of a red winey color with kind of bubbles on it. I don't even know what the song was.
It's probably Hold Your Fire. It sounds like the cover to Hold Your Fire, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I remember buying that. So I could be a bit of a libertarian deep down.
Or just have good taste in music. Possibly,
yes. Steve, I'd love to move on and discuss some of your writings in terms of, and you have a book title as well, The Microfoundations of Macroeconomics, and you also have a couple of articles or journal articles like Two Worlds at Once, Rand, Hayek, and the Ethics of the Micro and Macrocosmos.
Yep.
And there's a lot of conflict at present in economic theory, microeconomists versus macroeconomists. And I wonder, do you see that, or are you able to somewhat link the two and say one is a reflection on the other, or an extension of another?
Yeah. Well, certainly what I tried to argue in that book was that any meaningful macroeconomics has to be rooted in price theory and microeconomics. That at least for Austrians, what we mean by macroeconomics is the effects that this kind of system-wide effects that can happen because money is half of every exchange. But the reason why money matters and why that sort of, macro matters is not because it affects aggregates like GDP or unemployment per se, but rather because too much or too little money, what happens with monetary institutions, affects the individual prices that are the key to economic coordination and economic order. So the reason why we care about, say, inflation or deflation, the way why those matter is because they can disrupt the microeconomic signals of the marketplace. So ultimately, economic progress or lack of economic progress is about the microeconomy price signals, the sort of things that Austrians have long focused on. But what an Austrian macroeconomics can do is to recognize that those things will be affected by monetary institutions, and good monetary institutions, what we might call sound money, is important because it enables the microeconomy to operate as effectively as it can. And so what I was really doing in that book was sort of trying to demonstrate what it means to have how it is that sound monetary institutions produce the greatest degree of microeconomic order, and how inflation, deflation, and other kinds of problems can disrupt the microeconomic process. So for me, understanding macro is ultimately, the best line is Roger Garrison's. Roger says there may be macroeconomic questions, but there's only microeconomic answers, right? That ultimately why economies survive or thrive or fail is not a macro question. It's a micro question. It's a question of economic coordination, of entrepreneurship, of monetary calculation, of all the things Austrians talk about as being important in the microeconomy. But macro events like inflation and deflation can disrupt and harm those.
So this is a situation where you might have a Y variable and an X variable, and not knowing which is a causal link. For example, the recent financial crisis or the Great Recession, was this a micro problem that led eventually to a macro problem, or would have been a macro problem that has caused micro problems since?
Right. Good. So I think it's both. And it's right. I think we think about the Great Recession. We had a couple things going on. The macro problem that started it was excess credit from the Federal Reserve, right? And sort of the excess lending that took place really post 9/11 that sort of provided the spark, right? The gasoline that lit this thing on fire. But at the same time, or maybe the spark rather than the gasoline, but at the same time, you had bad policy that was artificially supporting the U.S. and housing market and other places, right? That channeled the excess credit created by the Fed into the housing market and sort of made possible rising housing prices, and then all the other kinds of financial instruments we had built on top of that. You had a U.S. regulatory system that was, favoring things like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and enabling them to buy up mortgages without having to worry about whether they were profitable or not. So you had a macro problem, the excess credit. You had interferences in the microeconomy that distorted incentives and prices. The result of that was an Austrian-style boom that manifested in the housing industry. And of course, when that turned to bust, right, you have system-wide, you have high unemployment, right, you have recession in terms of negative GDP growth. You have all the traditional macroeconomic problems. But notice, those macroeconomic problems were the result of distorted micro prices, distorted interest rates, distorted housing prices, distorted profit signals created by the favored treatment of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So I mean, we can go into more detail, but you're right in a sense that way I might put it is, what happened in the Great Recession was you had a macro distortion from the credit market combined with micro distortions in the housing market that led to a boom and bust, which are system-wide up and down in the economy. But again, you can't understand those macro consequences without focusing on the way in which prices and interest rates were distorted by both monetary policy and by regulatory policy.
How fearful are Austrian economists about the role of government and how larger it seems to be getting? Because you mentioned there about Fed policies, and I know some Austrian economists would favor free banking and the reduction in the powers of the Fed. But we see the increasing power of big government now, and that, as economists would typically worry about the role that they would have and the influence they would have on markets.
Yeah. And certainly Austrians have worried about the size of government almost from the beginning of Austrian economics. I mean, you certainly see it in Menger a bit, but Mises and Hayek growing, sort of being intellectually mature as they were coming to intellectual maturity sort of between the wars and into the sort of period of the Great Depression, World War II, were then worried about the size of government. And certainly, if both were alive today, they would be as well. And modern Austrians worry about this for a bunch of reasons. One, just from a sort of more narrowly economic perspective, Austrians have long argued that governments are notoriously inefficient, right? That governments can't allocate resources in the ways they think they can or wish they can. and we get tremendous waste from growing government. And that's the same sort of knowledge type problems that Mises and Hayek talked about with socialism in general applies on a somewhat smaller scale to other kinds of government intervention. But further worries here include the way in which not just the increasing size of government, but its scope of power and the reduction in the rule of law and more discretion to central banks and other institutions undermines the stability of the institutional framework that's necessary for economic growth. When entrepreneurs don't know what the rules of the game are, they don't know what choices to make, and that uncertainty makes it less likely that they'll make growth promoting choices. So we have a situation in which the distorting effects of monetary policy, of fiscal policy, of regulatory policy are creating an environment in which it's very difficult for entrepreneurs to read price signals and sort of figure out what to do. As a result, they tend to want to turn to politics to solve these problems, and we get we get this increase in sort of crony capitalism and the rise of state corporate partnerships that are, I think, Austrians rightly fear. And public choice analysis is important here too, and understanding that the incentives for politicians are such that they will grow government, and they will grow government in sort of conjunction with private sector firms who see in grabbing political power and political favoritism a way to make profits without having to worry about competition and pleasing consumers. And so from an Austrian perspective, what we're seeing happen is dangerous on multiple levels and problematic on multiple levels. I think if you go outside of Austrian economics, to the degree that many Austrians think of themselves as libertarians, they're worried more generally about, again, the sort of growth in the scope of power of the state, and not just its size, but its scope and the kinds of decisions it can make and the kinds of ways it can prevent private actors from making decisions are both, damaging to economic growth and human flourishing and human liberty.
And Steve, you were a member of the Mont Pelerin Society.
Yes, which is meeting even as we are recording this. They're meeting down in Miami, Florida.
Fantastic. Because I was just going to say, they have regular meetings, I think monthly meetings. Yeah. And I don't know if this is it is somewhat a closed society that you have to have go through some protocols in order to get membership. But what would typical meetings be like if you're able to discuss that or give an overview?
Yeah. I mean, they actually, the society has an international meeting every 2 years and has regional meetings in between those. It's more or less a really nice academic type conference, right? People present papers and discuss papers like you would see at an economics or a political science meeting. It's obviously more interdisciplinary than any one of those. And you have people, not just academics, but people from the policy world. I mean, it was created, one of the reasons Hayek was so keen to create it was to create a network, an institution, an organization where in the 1940s, the small number of classical liberals, libertarians could get together and share ideas and strategies and not have to worry about the pressures of their disciplines or the larger world. And he explicitly created it for intellectuals, not just academics. So again, you do have policy people and business people, all kinds of folks who attend those meetings. So there's nothing, weird or mysterious or nefarious going on. It's people, it's sharing ideas and networking about strategy and an opportunity to connect with people from around the world who share your values and beliefs and ways of seeing the world. And they're lovely. I haven't been to one for a little while, but they're always very lovely.
Steve, I've had a number of episodes in which we spoke about Adam Smith and Friedrich Hayek, and you've had a paper published in the Independent Review entitled From Smith to Menger to Hayek, Liberalism in the Spontaneous Order Tradition. And I think Menger here is the link going by that paper that would link Smith's thinking to Hayek's thinking regarding spontaneous order. Would you be able to fill the gap there and link the two economists for us through Menger?
Yeah. So I think the key, one way to think about it is, what you have in Smith, of course, is the sort of basic idea of the invisible hand and spontaneous order. What you don't really have in Smith, or at least he doesn't get it as right as we now have it, is the microfoundations of that, right? How exactly is it that this happens, right? Smith recognized that, it's not from the altruism of the butcher and from the kindness of the butcher, baker, the brewer that we get dinner, but from their self-love, right? That self-interest works to the benefit of other people. And he saw that point. And that's that's the key insight that makes economics a social science, right? A discipline, is that we have this thing this pattern that we're trying to explain all the time. What Menger and the early Austrians gave us, first of all, one thing, Menger also very clearly restated this idea of spontaneous order, particularly in his Principles of Economics book. There's the chapter on the origin of money, which was an article as well that gives us a great example of spontaneous order. But in his other book, the Investigations book into the Methods of Social Sciences, he really sets up spontaneous order theorizing as the way one does social science. And he has what's known as the Mengerian question, which is something along the lines of how can it be that institutions that serve the common interest come into being without a will directed towards establishing them, right? That nobody intended these institutions that benefit us, but they come into being. But so Menger had spontaneous order, but what he also had in his Principles of Economics was the Microfoundations, the idea, the role of subjective value, the importance of prices in guiding people's behavior, right? The role of profits as a signal, sort of the earliest bits of economic calculation are all there. And what happens after Menger, of course, is that the later Austrians, particularly Mises and then Hayek, build on this insight. And in Mises especially, we get a real fleshing out of the idea of economic calculation, of how people value things, about how prices and profits work and sort of how that micro process works. And then we come back to Hayek, who sort of returns that to the larger question of spontaneous order and focuses it in on the question of knowledge, which was there a little bit in Menger and not really too much in Smith. But what Hayek does is to say, what spontaneous orders are really about is, to use the title of this famous paper, the use of knowledge in society, right? How we generate order out of self-interest is by having this price system and other institutions that enable us to make use of other people's knowledge. And so what Hayek did was to sort of take the line from Menger and Mises and the sort of microeconomic theorizing and fold it back over onto the larger Smithian question of how spontaneous order or invisible hand processes work. And so from Smith to Menger to Hayek lays out this sort of development of this idea of the micro foundations of spontaneous order might be one way to think about it.
I've a lot more to dip into, Steve. If you don't mind me exploring a few more things, it'd be great. I feel you need to take a breather there or something. But
it's actually good. I'm on sabbatical this year, so I'm not teaching. I don't get too many opportunities to talk like this, so my stamina is good.
Fantastic. So, there's another thing I'd like to ask you about, and it's your open letter to my friends on the left, and you've explored economics and social theory of the family. And I know this is being published or translated into 5 languages. I just got to read the beginning of it and I can't wait to finish it off. But could you explain what this open letter is about and why you're talking about family here?
Well, okay. Well, there's 2 things that are going. The open letter to my friends on the left. This is the one from like 2008, right? That one was really about the Great Recession, but it's part of a sort of broader project. So let me see if I can step back for a second. I think, as I mentioned earlier, Pete Boettke and I were both students of the late Don Lavoie when we were grad students at George Mason. And one of Don's longstanding interests was how libertarians and how Austrian economists might better talk to the left, to progressives. And for Don always thought of himself as a man of the left. He has a wonderful book called National Economic Planning, What is Left, that plays off that idea. And so I think as students, for me anyway, as a student of Don's, that was always a motivating factor for me, is how do I persuade my academic colleagues, for example, who are mostly progressive leftists, that the ideas, sort of Austrian Hayekian ideas, are actually are not what they think they are, and are more kind of congenial means to the ends that they have and that we share than their own ideas are. So I'm always thinking about how do you persuade people on the left. That open letter was written in the absolute height or depth, I guess, of the financial crisis in September of 2008. And essentially what I was trying to do I was seeing, as one of the things I have an interest in is the Great Depression. And so I was thinking already in 2008, we're having something really serious happen here. I don't want this to turn into another Great Depression in the sense of people blaming this Great Recession on market failure and capitalism and so on. How do we start constructing a counter narrative that gets it right from the beginning. And so that open letter, sort of my goal there was to persuade people on the left or in the middle who were blaming what was happening as, sort of as a failure of markets and capitalism, that the story was much more complicated than that. And as we were talking earlier, it's really a failure of government policy, of excess credit, of bad housing policy, and other kinds of things. And to get that story out there as quickly as I could. And I wrote that in a couple hours one afternoon in a fury and posted it. This is even like before Facebook and before I was a blogger. I guess, well, not before I was already blogging. But posted on my personal website and then linked it on the Coordination Problem blog. And the thing just took off, right? I mean, that was my first thing that I kind of wrote that got me attention as a public intellectual, not just as a kind of, scholar academic. And it still gets, I just saw it linked on Facebook within the last week by someone. So it's still, people find it still today. I've written a lot more on the Great Recession, but that was the first piece I wrote, and it was writing as it was unfolding. And so that was a fun thing to do.
And it's amazing that you actually, you wrote down a few hours, and I'm sure with such passion as well.
Yeah. Well,
you were so honest in your openness, and I say that's the type of thing that gets attention.
Perhaps that was part of it, right? I mean, I wasn't going to mince words, but I wasn't going to, be insulting either. In fact, I remember exactly when I wrote it. I mostly wrote it in my head driving to the airport, and then I got to where I was going and had a couple hours and sort of wrote it all out. But yeah, that was that was one of my first attempts at sort of doing that kind of thing. And I'm very happy with how successful it was.
Would you think a lot of economists, and we do have there are a lot of economics blogs out there, do you think we're too pleasant or hold a little bit back, and should we be more argumentative or be more critical of policies or whatever it may be, instead of trying to not step on people's toes?
Well, I think that confuses two different things. I think that we have to be as honest and direct and forthright as we can be without being uncivil, right? I think when we think people are wrong, we need to say it and say it clearly and provide the arguments and evidence. There's no reason to mince words when it comes to describing things that we think are errors. Yes. But I think we can do that in ways that don't demonize people, that don't call people stupid or idiotic. There's just too many people out there, Paul Krugman being the worst offender, but Brad DeLong is another, right, who engage in these kind of, personal attacks and incivility with people they disagree with, questioning their motives and so on in ways that I think are just rude and counterproductive and don't serve the discipline well. So I think you can, as my friend Pete Becky would say, good science should hurt. And what he means by that is, if you're wrong, and someone should tell you you're wrong, and it should sting. You should feel bad for being told that your argument's bad or your evidence is bad. But that's not the same thing as saying someone's stupid or they're a tool of the Koch brothers or whatever, right? That's the kind of stuff we want to avoid. But I think being direct and honest and not mincing words, and when we see a bad argument, calling it a bad argument in the most civil way possible, that's an obligation I think we have as scholars, is to be that direct and that honest, but also an obligation we have to be that civil with each other too, and assume people are gauging in good faith, even if they're wrong, even if we think they're wrong.
In that open letter, you mentioned about the policies and the inadequacy or the inefficiency of government, and you wrote you did a nationally recognized research on the role of Walmart and the Coast Guard in response to Hurricane Katrina. And we saw this after the event, that local government and federal government, they just seemed incapable in what to do to respond to this. And was this an example of almost like a free market reacting to an event, and you had capitalism in the form of Walmart helping? I'm not sure what the role of Walmart is, but did they aid and help and house and feed the people around them?
Yep. I mean, what we saw happen, and not just Walmart, other private sector institutions as well. We should also mention sort of other civil society institutions like churches and so on. But my work focused on the private sector response, and Walmart, did a whole bunch of different things. The most important thing they did was they got almost all the stores that were damaged reopened within 10 days. Wow. So people had places to go for resources, in Louisiana and the rest of the U.S. Gulf Coast. But Walmart also gave stuff away. They gave away bottles of water. They gave away other kinds of resources to the community. In a couple cases, managers of stores just that had been damaged or destroyed just kind of took bulldozers and plowed salvageable goods out into the parking lot and said to people, come take them, right? Do what you need to do. They went into the pharmacy and brought medicine to local nursing homes, again, without charging people. So, Walmart and these other private sector organizations, were key in responding and responded more quickly than governments did in the sort of suburbs around New Orleans. The local sheriffs and mayors and stuff, said without Walmart, we never would have survived, right? That their ability to move resources quickly and get things into place and get their stores reopened was crucial. And we saw that in other places in the Gulf Coast, and we've seen it, in other disasters, right? Mm-hmm. When other natural disasters strike, we see all these examples of the private sector, stepping in and doing this work. I wrote an editorial for the Wall Street Journal about the ways in which private sector oil companies in Canada responded to the fires near Fort McMurray, Alberta. Very similar story to the Walmart story.
Wow. Can I ask also, Steve, about a presentation that you had done, and I'm very much interested in it, on the 3 economic myths. And
yes. Yeah. Well, I think that presentation was first done, for college students for Institute of Humane Studies, and then were turned into videos for part of that Learn Liberty series. One of those, certainly the 3 myths I tackle in there are that the cost of living, one of them is the cost of living has risen over the 20th century and into the 21st. Another myth is that the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. And the third myth I tackle in there is the gender wage gap idea, right? That women are systematically paid 77 cents on a dollar compared to men. And the video for that one has had over 1 million views on YouTube. So that one really struck a chord. So those are the 3 myths I tackle. I'm not sure how much I can say about each one of them. The analysis of the wage gap is pretty straightforward. Just the idea that we have to compare apples to apples. That is, the 77 cents figure comes from comparing essentially all men and all women. But when we look at men and women with similar qualifications and experience and similar ages and so on, that gap, while it doesn't totally disappear, goes down to just a few cents. And so sort of to say that market discrimination by employers is the explanation for the gap between men's and women's wages doesn't seem to hold much water, as far as economic theory and evidence goes. Now, there might be other things, explaining why, say, fewer women go into engineering than men do. There might be sexism involved there, but that's not employers' sexism. That might be sexism where we say to young girls, oh, you're not, girls don't do math. That sort of stuff matters because it affects the human capital investment people engage in. But people with the same human capital get paid roughly the same regardless of gender. So that was one of the 3 myths. I mean, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. There I talk
That's not happening at all, is it?
Well, what I argue is that it depends what you mean by that, right? If we track individual households, it turns out that there's still a significant degree of income mobility, that people who start out or who are poor in any given year, the majority of them are likely to be not poor 5 years later, and even more so 10 years later. And so we see, a degree of mobility in certainly in American, and I know the Canadian data too, North American societies have mobility. So it's not the case that people who are poor one year are going to be poorer in the future. Most of them are richer. And the reality is that everybody's getting richer, including the poor. And I have some data to support that as well. And the cost of living stuff basically looks at how many hours of labor does it take at the average wage to purchase goods and services like food and clothing. And the reality is most things have never been cheaper than they are now. And that's why we can afford to buy things like smartphones and pay more for healthcare and all these sorts of things.
Steve, I usually ask a number of quick-fire questions.
Sure.
If you'd like to work through them with me.
Mm-hmm.
The first one, I would like to know, if you were to step into the DeLorean and time travel, what era would you go back to? Who would you like to meet, and what conversation or question would you like to ask them?
Oh, God, well, let me just say one thing. I have no desire to time travel backwards in general, because I think we live in the best time to be alive there's ever been. But given the premise of your question, As an Austrian and as an intellectual, I would like to go back to somewhere in the mid 1930s and sit down with Hayek and talk with him about why he decided not to write a sustained review of Keynes's general theory. That remains one of the most perplexing questions. There's multiple different possible answers. They all might be true. But I think to go back and have that conversation with Hayek in 1937, 38 and understand what he was thinking and why he made that choice. And if I could go back in time and change history, persuade him that he should have. But yeah, I think that to me, off the top of my head, that would be the one conversation I might like to go back and have.
Was there evidence of him beginning to write a review?
Well, there's a little bit. I mean, if you read his 1941 book, The Pure Theory of Capital, the very last part of that book is a criticism of Keynesianism and Keynes in general. It's not specifically a systematic criticism of the general theory. So at least by that point, he recognized that he had to or should have done something. So there's some evidence that he thought about it. There's all kinds of answers that he's given, that other people have given. Some say Hayek thought it was pointless to criticize it. He had written a devastating criticism of Keynes's prior book, the 1930 book, Treatise on Money, devastating, long, two-part criticism that Keynes basically ignored when he wrote the general theory. So some people say Hayek just thought if he wrote a criticism of the general theory, Keynes would just ignore it. So what was the point? It's just not clear what the answer is, and that would be an interesting thing to go back to and figure out.
You're well published, and you have 3 books, as I mentioned in the show note, in the opening of this episode. Would you have any writing tips, or can you share some of your daily habits or morning habits to help you write your work?
People ask me this question from time to time, and I'm a terrible role model for this. And I'll explain. I do have a couple things I'll say, but I'll explain one reason I'm a terrible role model is I'm easily distracted. I like to say I have adult onset internet caused attention deficit disorder. And so there's people who say I have to turn off the internet or turn off Facebook or email, and I can't, and I'm easily distracted. But thankfully, I have the ability to go off task and go back on task very easily. I can be interrupted while I'm writing and keep going. That's me. That's not a system or anything I recommend. I do think the one thing that almost every academic who writes a lot would say is the most important thing is to write something every day. Even if it's a, serious Facebook post or whatever, right? Write something every day. Be in the habit of writing and, don't feel like you have to edit everything as you go along. You will, write, getting 1,000 words out, getting 2,000 words out in a good day, even if they're not great words, they're there. You can come back to them the next day and go over them and fix them up. I also think if for young scholars and writers in general, if you're stuck, if you feel like you have a writer's block, and I often do, especially when I'm sort of thinking about a column or something, 2 kinds of suggestions. One, just push through. I mean, people say this, but just start writing. Oftentimes, you'll figure out what it is you're trying to say as you start writing. There's an old aphorism among writers. How can I know what I think till I see what I say? Right. And I think the act of writing itself generates clarity and arguments, in ways that you aren't going to happen if you're just thinking. So trying to push through, trying to get things on paper, trying to write something, even if it's a short, but serious Facebook post, it's all writing. A long email to an academic friend about the thing you're working on, that's writing too. So just, sit down and make sure that you do some kind of writing every day. I think that's, to me, that's the best advice I can give.
Steve, what's the latest book you've read, or what one book would you recommend to our listeners?
Well, those are 2 different things, because the latest book I read was the new Robert H. Frank book, Success and Luck, which I'm reviewing for the Independent Review, and it's terrible. So I don't recommend that people read that. You'll have to wait for my review to come out to see why I think it's terrible. So that's the latest book I've read that I would not recommend. A couple of things that I've read, at least recently, that I really did enjoy. Let me grab a book off my shelf here. This is one I just finished reading a little bit ago by my friend John Moser, who's a historian, a U.S. historian, called The Global Great Depression and the Coming of World War II, which is an excellent look at the global dimensions of the Great Depression and how it fed into the kind of nationalism and reduction in trade that helped precipitate World War II. That's a terrific book that I finished not so long ago as part of my own next book project will be one on the Great Depression. And so nice. I read that as part of that.
Wow. Is there anything that you'd like to add, Steve, that I might have missed out and you would have liked to put a message out there on anything?
Well, we when we were talking earlier, we kind of got to it, but then we moved on to the open letter. But I would mention, my most recent book, which has now been out for almost exactly a year, called Hayek's Modern Family, which you mentioned in the opening, which is a look at the institution of the family through the lens of sort of Hayekian social theory and Austrian economics. It's available, you can get it at Amazon and through the publisher Palgrave. It's very expensive, but there are, if you search around on the internet, you'll find some shorter versions. There's a piece on parental rights at the Cato Institute that came from the book. I have a sort of overview of some of it called Capitalism and the Family that folks can find. And so that, pieces of the book are out there. It wouldn't surprise me if there is a full PDF out there somewhere, but I'm not going to say. So those are, I think, that's a good thing for people to do. And I think the other thing I'd say is, folks who don't know my work and have found this interesting and informative, the best ways to keep up with me are at least two things you mentioned early on. I blog at Bleeding Heart Libertarians. I write a regular column a couple times a month, sometimes more at the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE.org. But the best way to keep track of me is on Facebook. You should look me up on Facebook and follow me. I'm at the friend limit, but you can always follow me. And that's where I try to post, everything from my latest academic stuff to where my speaking gigs are to stuff on Rush and rock music to the food I'm eating to the sports I'm watching. So that's the best way to keep track of all things Horwitz.
And that's where I'm going straight after this interview. And Steve, I just love to ask one more question,
Sure.
if you don't mind. Your pedagogical approach to teaching, is there, of all the years that you've taught economics and all the different types of economics, is there one method that you feel is the most appropriate or effective method to connect with students?
Yeah. It's kind of a two-part thing, right? I think that a very broad thing I'd say is that thinking about teaching as coaching is a very valuable way to think about it. What you're trying to do is like a coach, help students develop a skill. In this case, the skill is the economic way of thinking, right? And so if you think about yourself as a coach and the way coaches work with athletes to develop a skill so that they can deploy it on their own, right? That's what you're doing. And I think one of the most effective ways to do that, especially with lower level economics classes, is you want to play. I think that adolescents, college students like to be cool. They like to be able to show their friends that they have a way of seeing the world that their friends don't. Like, their friends say something and you go, no, you think you understand that, but you really don't. Let me tell you how it really works. I think economics provides them with that. I think a good course on the economic way of thinking can be made attractive to young people, maybe particularly young men, but young people in general, by sort of playing into that, right? Like I can give you this set of tools, this way of critical thinking, this way of seeing the world that will enable you to see things that your friends can't, to understand things understand things differently than your friends do, that will make you more interesting, that will give you insight into the world, that'll help you make better decisions about your own life. That all of that, right, is a way to kind of help persuade students why economics is cool and why they want to be, shall we say, economic rock stars.
Yay! Steve, thank you so much for being so inspiring and for joining me on Economic Rockstar. I had a blast and I personally learned a lot from you.
Me too, Frank.
This episode was packed full of stuff that we covered so much. Yeah. Share once more again with our listeners where they can find you.
The best place is to look me up on Facebook. You'll know it's me when you find me. I have a public page, but you can also follow my personal page. You can also find me at FEE.org and at BleedingHeartLibertarians.com.
You can find all the links to Steve on economicrockstar.com/Steve Horwitz. Steve, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. You are definitely an economic rock star.
Thank you, Frank. My pleasure.
If you enjoyed this podcast, why not leave some feedback or comments on the show notes page on economicrockstar.com, where you can also sign up and be a member of the Economic Rockstar community. If you're listening to this episode on iTunes or Stitcher Radio, I would love to have some feedback and for you to leave an honest rating and review, as this will help with the rankings of the show so that more people can find it. If you're listening on the website economicrockstar.com, make sure you check out the back catalogue of all previous episodes and interviews with some amazing professors and authors at economicrockstar.com/podcasts. Thanks for listening, and I really appreciate your loyal support. I know how much you love audio, so why not get a free audiobook with Economic Rockstar today? I've teamed up with audiobooks.com to bring you this amazing offer. Visit audiobooks.com/rockstar to download your free audiobook now.
I think that we have to be as honest and direct and forthright as we can be without being uncivil. Right? I think when we think people are wrong, we need to say it and say it clearly and provide the arguments and evidence. There's no reason to mince words when it comes to describing things that we think are errors. All of that, right, is a way to kind of help persuade students why economics is cool and why they want to be, shall we say, economic rock stars.